Hello everyone and welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. Today we are talking again about motivation. Now, motivation is a little bit difficult to define. For those of you who listen to my podcasts, you will know that I always believe motivation is a force, a presence which is always with us. Yes, we can choose to ignore it and we can choose to do something else, but that in itself requires motivation. Some people say, "Oh, I'm not motivated to learn English today." But when you go and watch TV and smoke a packet of cigarettes, that also requires motivation. Most of the time, when we don't feel motivated, it's not because motivation isn't there, it's usually because of some other factor, like time, relaxation, pleasure. Motivation is still there, it's just you're choosing not to use it. Or you're using motivation to do something else, to relax, for example, to prepare the food for the children. So motivation isn't absent, and this is one of the dangers of thinking about it. If you honestly believe that motivation isn't there and it kind of comes and goes like the wind, then you're not going to get very much done because you're basically being sabotaged by your own ego. You're simply making excuses not to do the things that need to be done. If you're motivated today to sit down and do nothing, that's perfectly fine. And I'm not saying that you are a bad person for not studying English, but what I am saying is that it takes motivation to do nothing also, to make that decision. So it's very important that you recognize motivation is not the problem. Neuroscientists tell us that there's 4 forms of motivation. Now, I'm not sure how much I agree with this because after all, if I believe motivation is always there, then perhaps what I'm about to say doesn't accurately reflect my views. But the experts say that humans generally experience motivation when that part of our brain gets excited. We've all heard about chemicals such as dopamine or hormones which are relaying signals in our brains. But are we really just slaves to our brains? Is that all we are? I remember once a man that I had known, and generally he was a kind of what we would say in English, a fair-weathered man. He didn't really have a strong character, he was quite polite, but one day he lost a limb. He had some kind of an accident and they had to chop his leg off. Very sad, he lost a leg. But that brought out in him something which none of us had seen before. It made his character much stronger, probably because he had to work twice as hard to overcome and to work with his new disability. My point, though, is not about his disability. My point is that if we are purely flesh, bone, and brain, then cutting off someone's leg should weaken them and should somehow make them less able in life because they've lost a bit of their humanity. But actually, from my experience, that's not the case. My friend Tom, he lost his limb and he expressed more of masculinity and humanity than he previously had done. So, if we are only flesh and bone and brain, then taking away a bit of us would mean that we would lose a bit of our personality, But it doesn't work that way. And we all know people who are experts in their field because of something that's happened to them, not just because they are little blobs of brain cells. This is how I came to the conclusion that motivation is something which is always with us. Now, the experts say that there's 4 kinds. The first one they call extrinsic motivation. And this is the person who needs some kind of motivational factor. Promotions, financial gain, or maybe because they fear negative consequences, people won't look at them in the same way, or the boss might judge them. Then the second one is intrinsic motivation. And this is the one where you have an internal burning inside to succeed. It's something which is in you, and you know that you want to get it done. It's kind of like a deep thing. You don't need an external reward. So when that email from the boss putting you on that new project comes, there's a fire burns inside you. The next one is called the introjected motivation. And this is where negativity comes up with the voice, no, I can't do this. I need more support. I need more help. And you begin to convince yourself that it's impossible. And you start to have negative reactions, which might bring about sickness, which might seriously impact you. And you need positive interaction and reassurance to get that going. The last one is identified motivation, and this is incredibly complex. It's the need to do something, like the project that you've been given, but you wait to the last minute to get it completed. Now, we've all known people in the movies, very creative people, who look like they are doing nothing, and at the very end they get the job done with no problem. And the boss says, your ways are really strange, but you always come up with the goods, meaning you always finish well. These people often aren't liked at work or are viewed with suspicion, but after a while the boss learns to trust them. He knows that the job will be done. One good example of the last one might be the TV show Bewitched. I don't know if you remember that, it's quite old. That's the one where Darren Stevens is an advertising executive and he's married to a witch and his mother-in-law hates him. And it seriously impacts on his life and on his job. But in the end, everything always turns out well, usually at the last moment. In English, we sometimes refer to the last moment as the 9th hour. So at the 9th hour, everything is fine. So these are the different types of motivation which people have. And I'm wondering what kind you are, and also how this affects your ability to learn. Well, certainly if you have some kind of expectation of financial gain or promotion or new job, that's a really good way to get you started. But if that job isn't coming, if the phone calls aren't coming in, or if you haven't even applied for the job yet, are you still motivated? I know I wouldn't be. But then again, if motivation's always with us, maybe we just need to learn to relax a little bit more and get on with the job. From my experience of people and people who are learning languages, it seems to me that most suffer from introjected motivation. They have this negative internalized motivation, which says, first of all, that it can't be done, or it's going to be done with a lot of negativity, or the stimulus could be guilt, perhaps, of not completing a previous project. But there would be a lot of feeling of, how can I say, negativity around the project and the person. Most people I speak to seem to have some awareness that their English can't get better. It's stuck and it's not going to get better. They've tried before, they've tried other teachers, they've tried different methods, and their English is surely going nowhere. Some of these people even tell me in such grand ways, almost like Shakespeare, just how bad their English is. These kinds of self-judgments and prejudices, of course, are types of self-fulfilling prophecies, because the more you tell yourself how bad your English is, the more worse it will become, because you'll be expecting negative feedback, you'll be expecting to lose your job, you'll be expecting to fail that interview, and ultimately you've created a world for yourself where English is certainly difficult. If you really want to see motivation in action, especially if you have trouble getting going, then you really need to consider doing warm-up exercises. This is a little bit like going to the gym. Now, I mentioned this in a podcast last week. If you just go to the gym and do exercise, you're being very hard on yourself there. If you go from being asleep, all the way up to doing exercise very, very quickly, then you could harm yourself, and it's kind of like a punishment, you know. But if you get up from bed, do some warm-up exercises before you start doing heavy exercise, then it's a little bit easier. You're slowly preparing your body. Let's call the warm-up exercises a ritual. So when it comes to learning a language, you can also have your warm-up exercises. You can also have your rituals to get you going. And these are very, very important. So I would recommend that you, before you jump into English first thing in the morning, have your cigarette for 5 minutes if that's what you usually do. But don't contemplate too long on why you shouldn't be learning English or the other things you have to do. Simply take a first step, maybe by reviewing some words that you learned yesterday, or perhaps just by casually opening a grammar book or putting on some English TV, maybe a cartoon, something easy, something you know you can do. Have it sitting close by so that when you're having your coffee or you're smoking, you can see it and it kind of gets you in the mood. To go from nothing straight into English, it is a little bit rough, especially in the early days of learning. So these are just a few ideas for you. I hope you've enjoyed this on motivation, but I would just say, remember my words, motivation is always with us, and if you try to blame it as a way of not learning, you need to be careful with that, because that could come right around and slap you on the face. The reason why you're not learning effectively is probably tied up in something else, such as your time, whether your idea of learning really is justified, whether you need to spend 3 hours a day studying. Perhaps you need to look at your timetable, but motivation generally is not the problem. The motivation points to the problem. It can give you clues as to why you're not in front of your books right now. But it's something else, perhaps, for you to examine. And that thing is usually intensely personal, relating to time, people, family, other stressors in your life. Remember, language is not something which can exist alone. It needs other people to share with you too. That's the nature of language. It's to express. And if you're trying to go at this alone, that's something else for you to examine. See you. Bye.